We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
Europe in crisis. Leaders agreeing on a fiscal pact to centralize decision-making and limit spending.
It may all end up here in Luxembourg. According to the agreement negotiated in Brussels, any country that spends more than 3% of its gross national product will be prosecuted here at the European Court of Justice.
So will the euro survive now? Will there be more downgrades? And will more centralization work? Opponents to the currency are raising their voices.
You are all in denial. By any objective measure, the euro is a failure. And who is actually responsible? Who's in charge out of you lot? Well, of course, the answer is none of you, because none of you have been elected, none of you actually have any democratic legitimacy for the roles that you currently hold within this crisis.
At this time of increasing division, it's fallen upon the shoulders of this man, Klaus Regling, to manage the short-term crisis.
So how many people do you have working here?
We have been growing rapidly the last 12 months, and we are now 25 staff.
Mr. Regling is head of the European Bailout Fund, or the EFSF, backed by guarantees from the European Union. His fund has already bailed out Greece, and it's designed to help more nations pay their bills if they request assistance.
If there's a need to do more, Europe, the euro area, the governments of the euro area stand ready to do what is needed to make sure that financial stability in the euro area is preserved. That commitment is very, very strong, and I think it's often underestimated.
If you needed more cash from the member states, how much do you think you could get?
That's impossible to say, because it would depend on the needs at that moment in time. And at the moment, we don't know at all whether there's need for more. I'm only saying if there were, then I'm confident it would be made available.
How much do you expect you will have to pay for Greece? Does anyone know?
That's being discussed right now in Athens. In general, the European Council has said, the governments of the euro area, that they want to support Greece in a second program. We had the last 18 months the first adjustment program. Now we are moving towards the second program. And the Troika, which means the Commission, IMF and ECB, are in Athens right now to negotiate the details. And the details, of course, are key, because details means where does the Greek government have to take additional fiscal consolidation, economic reform measures. And only when that is clear can an estimate be made what are the financing needs, what is the financing gap that needs to be closed. So it has to be all done in one big package. One cannot say you get 100 billion and then we see what happens. Underlying all that is conditionality, which is key, and the EFSF, like the IMF, never provides financing without conditionality agreed beforehand. And that's why we also every quarter have a monitoring mission in Athens to see whether they comply with the conditionality before the next disbursement is made. So the Troika is doing that job. They will report back to the Eurogroup, so the finance ministers of the euro area and the IMF in January. Then we will know what the amount of money is that is needed. But I gave this rough number of 100.
Is that the number that's sort of at the back of your mind that you might earmark at this point for?
Roughly, yeah. We really don't know the details, but roughly part of that will be financed by the IMF.
So you may be paying something like 70% of that, 70 billion euros is what you're kind of in your mind.
But again, the number is very rough. In addition, though, we have to provide 30 billion that will be given to make it possible that private sector creditors do a debt reduction of 50%. The last summit in late October already decided that they would support such an operation by providing 30 billion in sweeteners to make this debt exchange, which involves the 50% in the net present value of the private sector claims, possible. So that also would come from the EFSF.
At this point in time, we know that the IMF has been given 200 billion euros. From your earlier answer, are you indicating that you think member states might be willing to give the IMF more money?
Well, when you look at the conclusions of the summit last Friday, it was agreed that the European countries would very likely provide an additional 200 billion euro, which is about $265 billion, to the IMF, to the general resources of the IMF, to beef up the firepower of the IMF. The hope and expectation is that other G20 countries would also provide direct credits to the IMF so that the firepower again will go up, so that the IMF is prepared to help in case of need. And one more point on the firepower that's important. We are developing a system where our own resources, EFSF resources, can be leveraged by attracting private investors who otherwise might not be interested in buying bonds of some of our member states. And
but as things stand now, you're confident that with the help that you could get from the IMF, you could handle even a situation where Italy runs into trouble and isn't able to raise money in the market?
Yes, certainly for 12 months or so.
We are at a crossroad, whether we are going to continue something which has economically not worked out, and whether we continue even to sacrifice democracy.
Professor Marcus Kerber, a long-standing opponent of the European Bailout Fund. He filed and lost a lawsuit earlier when the German Constitutional Court ruled the fund could be established under certain conditions. But he says the fund must be and will be reined in.
Germany will not vote in favor of leveraging the fund's money, because that would certainly bring us closer to collapse. And apart from that, Germany, as a representative in the European financial stability, is not allowed to leverage the sums at stake there. This has been quite clearly said by the Constitutional Court. That's why we wouldn't have any Eurobonds. So today, Mr. Regling is in a desperate position, as most of the people in Brussels, and he tries to overcome that despair by wishful thinking.
What is Professor Kerber's problem, shall we say, with what is going on? Is it that you're convinced it's not going to work, or is it that you're convinced it's illegal and shouldn't be allowed to work?
Well, I think the legal problem we have is not only a problem of sovereignty. Of course, Germany is losing her fiscal sovereignty if the process which has been triggered off in 2010 will go on. And this is what was the question at stake in the Constitutional Court. But as a nation, the German people is represented by the members of parliament. And there is, so to speak, a royal privilege of the parliament. That is to decide about taxation, that is to decide about income, about indebting the country, or how to finance the country. So the court quite recently said, in accomplishment to what has been said on the 7th of September, that there will be no bailout and no funding by Mr. Regling's institution without prior consent of the budget committee of the Deutsche Bundestag. So there is an obstacle, and Mr. Regling is not allowed to intervene as a caretaker and to take makeshift decisions without the support and the explicit support of the German parliament, not for an overall strategy, but for any concrete, precise bailout, which, in my opinion, doesn't fit his wishes, because he wants to act autonomously, quickly, in order to prevent crisis. So there is a total mismatch. So the question is whether Germany is going to give up the budgetary rights and transfer them totally either to Mr. Regling or to the European Commission, or whether these democratic fundamental rights which the Parliament exerts on behalf of the citizens will remain in Germany. And as the main donor country, apart from France, I think the German people has a right to claim these rights and to consider them as unalienable.
All right, you've raised some sovereignty concerns. It's been raised by some politicians in Europe.
This is not a concern of sovereignty. This is the category of democracy. So a democracy leaves,
sovereignty, and constitutional.
Democracy is of no sense if you no longer have the right to veto financial decisions which have an impact on future generations.
Well, we haven't seen widespread public protests over this issue, have we? How many people really share your concerns?
I think if you have a poll today, 85% of the German people disapprove the Euro rescue policy, or what is called the Euro rescue policy. And there's a historic split between civil society on one hand and the political class, in particular the European elite, the Brussels elite, which is more or less an oligarchy. It's not in the mentality of the German people to have riots in the street. This is a privilege of the French. They demonstrate for everything, mainly for the defense of social interests. I think we will get very soon very close to a situation where the erosion of power of the German government will find public disapproval. But the Euro problem and European policy is now, and this is a historic moment, for the first time, the national issue. Whenever you talk to people, they are concerned by nothing more than the Euro problem. Why? Because the German people consented to a transfer of sovereignty, of monetary sovereignty. And they obviously gave more, contributed more than Malta. I don't say this in order to offend Malta, but this is a matter of sheer size.
Okay, so if the German people have consented to it, and the Brussels elite...
They did not consent in order to surrender unconditionally to Brussels administration. Germany and the German people consented, and in those days, in '92, the German Bundestag, the parliament, consented on condition that there will not be a fiscal union.
Professor Kerber is not alone in raising strong criticism. Some British members of the European Parliament also say Brussels technocrats have gone too far.
When Mr Papandreou got up and used the word referendum, or Mr Wren, you described it as a breach of confidence, and your friends here got together like a pack of hyenas, rounded on Papandreou, had him removed and replaced by a puppet government. What an absolutely disgusting spectacle that was. And not satisfied with that, you decided that Berlusconi had to go. So he was removed and replaced by Mr Monti, a former European Commissioner, a fellow architect of this Euro disaster, and a man who wasn't even a member of the Parliament. It's getting like an Agatha Christie novel, where we're trying to sort of work out who's the next person that's going to be bumped off. The difference is we know who the villains are. You should all be held accountable for what you've done. You should all be fired. And I have to say, Mr Van Rompuy, 18 months ago when we first met, I was wrong about you. I said you'd be the quiet assassin of nation-state democracy, but you're not anymore. You're rather noisy about it, aren't you? You, an unelected man, went to Italy and said this is not the time for elections, but the time for actions. What in God's name gives you the right to say that to the Italian people?
I'm very frequently in Brussels. I know the selfishness of the Brussels elite. They help each other very much. They are what I call a Euro cartel. Unfortunately enough, for the European population, reality is stronger than their discourse. And their very selfish discourse claims the right, the privilege to act without bounds, without legal bounds. May I remind you of the fact that the European Treaty is derived power. It is transferred sovereignty, step by step, since 1958. And the great success of the European community was to use these transferred competences in order to create the common market, in order to create a system of unrestricted competition. So ever since the Euro project has become a religious ambition, mainly of the French government and of the Brussels elite, which are mainly inspired by French thought, who have declared that as the political project, they cannot admit that it's a failure. I expect from a responsible politician that he admits from a certain point of the empirical development onwards to say the project is turning out to be an adventure. So to say our arguments are ludicrous is an offense for all those citizens all around Europe who are very, very much concerned about what is happening, and they are concerned that apart from the, let's say, ludicrous decisions which have been taken for more than 18 months by now, which have not solved the euro crisis, that they don't, that they will lead finally not only to giving up the project, but to a total political disintegration. The isolation of Great Britain as a result of the summit is the beginning, perhaps, of a gathering storm. And I'm that much in favor of stopping the adventure. and finding a soft landing for the Euro project with, fortunately, no winners and no losers. This is impossible. There will be always winners and losers, but an orderly unbundling of the Eurozone, because I see great dangers for the political disintegration in Europe.
You know what else the Eurosceptics say now? They're saying that this process basically allows unelected technocrats, perhaps like yourself, to take over, even subvert democracy in Europe. As we've seen, a referendum had to be cancelled under pressure in Greece, and now we're talking about national budgets being more or less taken over by unelected technocrat officials. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't really understand that. Mr. Monti was elected by the Italian parliament, and that's the system in Italy. It's not like the US or France, where the prime minister, the president, is elected by the population. Italy has always had a system like some other countries like the UK, where the parliament elects the prime minister. This is what happened in Italy. The same happened in Greece, where the parliament elected Mr. Papademos. The fact that these are real experts does not mean that they are not also politicians, and certainly the process is absolutely democratic one and the normal one for these countries.
As you know, Eurosceptics are glee, aren't they? They're saying the whole last 2 years have really shown this Euro project is not working, it's doomed. How do you respond to that?
I think that's really a stupid statement. Sorry. The Euro is not doomed. The Euro will exist for a long time. And it's also not correct to argue that the strategy to preserve financial stability in the monetary union is not working. It is working in some countries. It's not working very well so far in Greece. That's correct. The Troika is in Athens right now to work on that, negotiate the second adjustment program. But Ireland is a big success story. That's often ignored because many focus on negative news coming out of Greece. Ireland has a lot of positive news. Competitiveness has been improved. Half the competitiveness problem Ireland had accumulated during the first decade of EMU has been eliminated. They will continue and have to continue to work on the other half. The current account deficit in Ireland has moved into surplus this year, and this surplus will continue to grow. So very clear indication that there are improvements in competitiveness. And markets have realized that, and the long-term interest rates for Ireland have come down from about 14% in the summer to now 8.5%. Portugal, the other country where we provide liquidity assistance, has started its program 6 months later than Ireland, but they are on a very good way. They have gotten all the green marks from the Troika, and I'm sure it will also become a success story. So the strategy is working. To make it very clear, the Euro will be there for decades to come.
But my
I
question
know
is,
that
who's going to
markets don't
manage
believe
it?
that. So
Who's going to manage it now if yields are rising?
The Euro will be there for a long time. And markets will understand that there's enough firepower. If more countries than the three that at the current situation get financial assistance from their European partners and the International Monetary Fund, at the moment that's Greece, Portugal and Ireland. If more countries think they need it, at the moment there's no other country, but if countries want help, it would be available through European partners, through the EFSF, in the future the ESM, through the IMF. The firepower is there. Most of the EFSF resources have not been used so far. The ESM will be pulled forward into 2012 to become operational 1 year earlier than expected. The IMF will get more money. That was also decided. So the situation is not as bad as the markets believe.
Firepower is rising.
Firepower is rising, and also importantly, the summit decided to review the firepower, if necessary, by March next year. That's in 3 months' time. By then we will know whether more is needed. At the moment, I think we have more than enough.
What has been achieved by the Euro rescue is nothing. The markets are today in greater turmoil than ever before. So the fundamental solution I propose is a split of the Eurozone according to the categories of competitiveness. We have got to get back to industrial fundamentals, and we cannot mix up countries which are as heterogeneous as Germany and Greece.
So you talk about some countries leaving the Eurozone?
So I think whether some countries leave or whether the the trade balance surplus countries leave, that's a question of modality, that's a question of operational tactics. But sooner or later, we have to readjust the Eurozone and we have to unbundle the project.
Well, first let me say that Europe has a lot to go for it. Budgetary problems in the euro area are a lot smaller than in the US, Japan or the United Kingdom, so other mature industrialized economies. We have a much smaller deficit, less than half of what the US has, and on a way towards balanced budgets. I think the US and Japan cannot even dream of such a situation. So we have a lot going for us. We are working on our growth prospects through structural reforms, improving the growth potential of European countries. A lot to go for it. International investors, of course, have to look at the world, and that's what they do. They look at all investment opportunities around the world. It's very difficult not to then also allocate some funds to the euro area, because the euro area accounts for 20% of the world GDP. We don't grow as fast as emerging markets, but they have a lot of catching up to do, because the per capita income in Europe is very high, and emerging markets are catching up to that. That's why they have high growth rates. And for certain investors, that's very important. And we cannot compete with that. But we have a lot to go for us. We are one of the pillars of the world economy, very open economies, very reliable legal system, obviously. We are open. We are not a fortress Europe, as some people think. The EU treaty guarantees the openness of the EU towards third countries. So investors coming from outside the EU have the same rights that every investor has from inside the EU. These are very strong arguments.
But what about that other looming issue, a possible credit downgrade of countries in Europe? Could that affect the ability of the bailout fund to operate as planned?
If we get a downgrade of countries like France and Germany, then the bet, which is made by the European Financial Stability Facility, will not work, because they will not be able to raise money at conditions which are interesting for the receiver countries. That's very, very simple.
They'll just increase the cash buffer.
The cash buffer, perhaps, but they will not be able to raise, if Germany loses the AAA and France loses AAA, they will not be able to raise money and conditions necessary in order to bail out other countries.
Well, I don't expect that we will be downgraded.
If it happens.
But if there's a general problem in Europe that many countries are downgraded, this will all become a bit more difficult. That's true.
What's your contingency plan?
At the same time, if everybody, including the US, is downgraded from AAA to AA, and if there are no more AAA countries left, then we live in a new environment, and we have to see what that means.
So you're not too worried about that prospect?
No, we have to monitor it and be ready, but it really depends on what happens in the rest of the world.
So you're not worried at this point about the prospect of referenda, you're not worried about perhaps legal challenges to the legality of what some are terming as a loss of sovereignty for countries?
Well, all these legal questions need to be dealt with, and the experts are beginning to do that. The loss of sovereignty, of course, that's a different issue. Because the decisions taken do imply some loss of sovereignty, but that's what we wanted. Because if we want more centralized control over budgetary policies, it does mean, at least for the countries that don't comply with the rules, a loss of sovereignty. So that was exactly what everybody wanted. So that should not be, I'm not concerned about it. That's exactly why these decisions are positive and will lead to better functioning monetary union.
The strong currency countries, the traditionally strong currency or hard currency countries like Germany, Netherlands, Austria, Finland, to a certain degree as well, Luxembourg, they will not be willing, at least their populations will not be willing, to continue endless bailouts in order to sacrifice their public finances and to sacrifice democracy.
So what becomes apparent as you walk by the icons of former division in Europe, like the Brandenburg Gate behind me here, is that the whole struggle and debate is not just about saving the euro. It's also increasingly about the very notions of European solidarity and unity. Well, whatever happens next, there's likely to be further division before the whole issue is resolved. For Talk to Al Jazeera, I'm Sami Zaidan in Berlin.